Since 1995, over 26,000 international students from all walks of life join the British Investigators training courses in anomalous phenomena within ufology, paranormal and supernatural, parapsychological study, anomalous phenomena, science, hypnotherapy, spiritualism, astrology, astronomy, cryptozoology, and many other areas. Our certified self-study courses will teach you how to assess, analyze, engage, formulate, document, and be cognizant of all types of phenomena, suitable for light workers and starseeds, curious personalities and inquisitive minds, skeptics alike and truth seekers.
So I'm particularly interested in Victorian Gothic literature, and ghost stories is just one subgenre of that. So I just wanted to start off by I titled this, A Haunted Culture, and I want to give you a sense of why I chose that as a title later on. Okay, welcome everybody. Okay, good. Found a seat there. And one of the things that I did just want to note was that I think when many of us think of the stereotypical or the standard or traditional ghost story, we tend to imagine an English Victorian interior. I'm talking about heavy drapery and patterned wallpaper and the heavier oriental carpets and big, strong woodwork and trim. And does anybody recognize this photograph right here?
Was that one of the visiting rooms?
No, not a visiting room. This is actually a kind of simulation of a Victorian interior, but this is from Disneyland. I haven't actually seen this, the Disneyland's Haunted Mansion. Exactly, and one of the things that's interesting about that is that for the exterior, they chose an antebellum exterior, so that's like an American South kind of exterior. So there's really a mismatch between the exterior of this haunted mansion in Disney and the interior. I mean, it was the sense that they had to go to Victorian England to somehow create that sense of spookiness, I mean, my understanding, and Christina, our Americanist, could jump in here if you'd like to, but my understanding of the antebellum interior is that it tends to be a lot more light, more airy, But no, it's Victorian England that they went back to for this interior. And then here is just a cover of a Nancy Drew mystery. Oh, it's a message in a haunted mansion. Well, she's American, but again, we're going to Victorian England in terms of that general look for the notion that this is the space that is haunted. And I did just want to say a couple things about the ghost story, as a particular genre of Gothic literature. Vampire tales would be in there as well. It's really that is coming to us from the Goths back in England's ancient past. The Goths as a Germanic tribe that battled the Anglo-Saxons. In the 19th century, they're really associated with a kind of barbarity for many Victorians. But at the same time, their architecture had a kind of massiveness, and the way in which the Goths tended to favor soaring spaces really gave you this sense that it was somehow opening out onto the unknown. And that's why we tend to have so many churches and institutions of higher learning modeled, patterned after this Gothic style. And anybody recognize this picture right here?
Is that the chapel?
Yeah, exactly. That's the chapel, the O'Neill Memorial in the chapel. And so this photograph is from, I think it's about the mid-1930s. So this is very much, you can see that Gothic look in terms of the arches and the triptych. That's the look that the sisters were actually going for when they originally created Mercyhurst. And then just to note real quickly, as I was saying, Gothic literature, ghosts, vampire tales. Another staple of this kind of literature that really started with Walpole's Castle of Otranto in 1764. You tend to have these hulking, dangerous, sexually malevolent villains and damsels in distress. The earliest Gothic novel Castle of Otranto, I can't say that it's very scary at all. I mean, my students find it screamingly funny. It's really clunky, you know, but nonetheless, it did kind of set the stage for a lot of the Gothic literature that came later.
What is the name of it?
Castle of Otranto. So, and you can, yeah, find that one pretty easily, you know. The ghosts in it are just so incredibly goofy. I mean, you know, like one is this giant figure who's laying out the length of the hall. So one of the, I believe it's one of the servants comes upon it, and there's this big leg and foot in front of him. You know what I mean? Like that's the big specter. Or sort of a helmet crashing in through the roof. You know, we're just, it's almost, it does feel very, like it's parodying itself. It's, Brian, did you want to jump in?
It's kind of an absurd thing. I mean, you know,
It
for the
is.
first Gothic piece, it's outrageous and absurd and, you know, very unusual. Lots of exclamation points.
That's right, lots of exclamation points, you know, and I want to treat it earnestly in the class because this is setting up the Gothic, but then at the same time we're laughing. So, you know, it kind of resists what you want to do with it in some ways. So before we move on, you know, just this sense of Gothic architecture, anybody want to note what you think we're seeing here? Mercyhurst, 1932. So that's before the lake was drained. And you can get this sense of, you know, the Gothic, you know, it's just this sense of the massiveness of the building. But at the same time, we do have these kind of pointed spires, you know, that are pushing upward. And I know in terms of getting that roof, that the sisters really, that was a tremendous financial challenge to be able to get that authentic look for the, what is it made of, slate? Is that what I'm trying to say? Yeah, slate, very expensive. They had to sort of put up a lot of their own money. And then if you look real closely, we kind of have these spectral figures down here right around the lake. If you look at the photograph itself, you can see that a couple of them are men, you know, which I found kind of interesting, sort of lurking there around by the lake. And one of my students said, forget about these men, forget about the lake. You know, what's amazing about this picture is the parking spaces. We were just talking about that. You're like, look at that, they're sitting right next to the building. You know, that was what they found was notable about this picture. Yeah,
So what side of the building was that?
well, that's from the back, isn't it? That's where the lake would have been?
It'd really be looking from right here almost. If you look down
Yeah,
there,
exactly.
by the curb.
Exactly. As I was walking up today from here, what I call the back, I was thinking, well, that must have been where the lake was, right? I mean, in this area right between the buildings. Yeah, that's right. So, I did just want to note, you know, several Victorian writers of ghost stories. Charlotte and Emily Bronte, they tend to embed the specter of the ghost in their longer novels, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights. Charles Dickens wrote a number of shorter ghost stories, Elizabeth Gaskell, Henry James, Turn of the Screw, Wilkie Collins, Woman in White. And here's just a etching of Charles Dickens sitting there in his study. And this right here is a painting of the Bronte sisters, Anne, Emily, and Charlotte. And that was actually painted by their brother Branwell. And it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in the Victorian Gothic class that's really been a kind of mystery for a lot of scholars is how we could have three such talented young women write these novels that would become enduring classics when they just lived out in the absolute boondocks and had very much interrupted, kind of low-level educations, you know? I mean, they were not upper class. They were...
They never smiled.
Excuse me?
They never smiled.
Never smiled? Yeah, it is quite serious. I mean, it's almost, Charlotte's got a little maybe beginning of a smile. I don't know, do you want to grant her that, you know? So... But anyhow, it was really their brother Branwell. They created this whole fantastic world when they were young, Angria, and he got this set of toy soldiers, and they would create all these stories about these soldiers, and they would actually write them and self-publish them, you know, bind them together into books and hand them out to family friends.
But, you know, it doesn't matter where you grow up or what kind of environment you live in. children are creative, adults
Right.
are creative. We have to give them credit where credit is due. And
That's right.
only it's self-limitation that imposes restrictions on a human being's intelligence.
You know, it's kind of interesting because the Bronte sisters, they lost their mother when they were very young. And their father was a parson, and he kind of let them do whatever they wanted. You know what I mean? Like, they did not have sort of that traditional female upbringing. So there is this sense where they had this freedom to just spend hours and hours in this creative world. But you know, they always thought that it was Branwell, the brother, that he was the one who was going to become the great author. They saw him as the great talent. And you know, he painted this portrait, and I think this is just the goofiest explanation ever. He later said that, oh, I think the portrait's too cluttered. So he rubbed himself out. And it's just one of the most interesting portraits to me. I mean, of course, if you're doing a family portrait, you know what I mean? You're going to want everybody in there, all the siblings. What ended up happening with him is that he had a disgraceful love affair with a married woman. He became addicted to laudanum, which was an opium mixture, and to alcohol. I mean, he ended up coming back to the parsonage. He had absolutely horrible delirium tremens. He ended up dying of consumption, but the alcoholism was so bad that the doctors sort of weren't able to pick up on what was exactly happening to him. So, I mean, again, he was a kind of cover for them when they were younger, that it was okay for them to indulge in all these imaginative pursuits in writing because it was all for Branwell. But then, of course, it was the sisters who would go on to create the enduring classics. And that's just what I want to know. I mean, a lot of children, absolutely, I agree with you, are incredibly imaginative, and we do want to try to restrict that, but they don't all become the Bronte sisters, you know what I mean? Like, that's part of the mystery. One thing we do know is that they had a circulating library, so they were able to check out and read a lot of the contemporary works. A lot of those works were Gothic, so that helps to explain the kind of mystery a little bit. So, you know, really just one major question I had is, I mean, a lot of times when historians are talking about the Victorian era, so this is named after Queen Victoria, we're talking 1832 to 1901, people see this very much as the age of progress, or sometimes it's called the age of materialism, and many of us will think of the Industrial Revolution. You know, we're thinking about the age of progress. This was a period, I mean, it's a fairly long period, but you know, we've got the Bessemer steel manufacturing method that was created, which allowed for the creation of much larger, stronger buildings. It was the beginning of pasteurization, so people could live longer, healthier lives. The invention of the microscope, the invention of the stethoscope. I mean, it just seemed like every area there were these incredible scientific and technological advances. Age of materialism, when we think of a Victorian era, it tends to be all cluttered with all kinds of stuff, you know. You see that all over in the novels, this sense of upward striving in terms of what you own and how you display it. And then, you know, certainly in terms of the Industrial Revolution that many of us are familiar with. So in a lot of ways, there's this sense that this is a period in which the culture is moving, you know, relentlessly onward and upward. So then, you know, like the question is, well, why did the Victorians, and I'm really suggesting, you know, it's servants, shopkeepers, and aristocrats in terms of a much wider reading audience, why did they enjoy ghost tales? Because that's all about the presence of the past, about the past intruding on the present, right? How we can never escape the past. So, and I think one interesting way to approach or to think about ghost tales is, you know, well, what is it that has been lost or somehow repressed in terms of this, again, relentless move forward? And I think a lot of the authors in a kind of displaced way are asking that. I think one reason that we had interest in ghosts and specters and the afterlife had to do with this increasing doubt about traditional religious teachings. And there were, you know, basically just three areas that caused this increasing doubt. You know, like John Stuart Mill had this incredible crisis of faith. He was very religious when he was young, but he ended up becoming basically agnostic for a long period. John Ruskin lost his faith. You know, geology and all these geological discoveries were showing the Victorians that if you were to plot out the age of the earth in terms of the Bible, in terms of doing a genealogy of the Bible, geology was showing that the earth was in fact much, much older than that. So that really challenged the notion of Scripture as the inspired Word of God. And John Ruskin once said, you know, at the end of every Bible verse, I hear that infernal chink of the geologist's hammer. You know, again, like that, just that sense of doubt. And also biblical scholarship, very objective and rigorous, was going in. This was primarily the Germans, but then a lot of the English were picking up on it as well. In terms of biblical scholarship, they were showing all the discrepancies between the Gospels and doing a lot of work with dating and errors, and many Victorians were becoming aware of that, again, just really increasing that sense of doubt for many of them. And then, of course, with the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, here we have this image of human beings as descended from primates as opposed to being made in the image and likeness of God. And it's kind of amazing how many of the ghost or kind of horror tales from the period feature some monkey-like creature. Even though it's not a ghost, even in Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, Hyde is very much described in an monkey-like way. You know, that becomes a sense, that's what people fear, that's what is from the distant past that comes to haunt them. So there's just a couple, you know, reasons that we have this sense of doubt, but nonetheless, at the same time, there were so many Victorians who were interested in trying to prove or trying to make some connection with loved ones in particular in the afterlife. This is very much an age of mediums. We have many of these in America as well. I was wondering if any of you been to Lilydale up here in New York, the spiritualist community. Have any of you been in the archives there? It's not necessarily archives. They have a lot of the pictures sit out, like the spirit photography with the mediums, where they have the, I've got a couple of photographs of those. Yeah, so anybody remember exactly when Lilydale was founded? I know it was 19th century, but I didn't look up the actual date. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting, though, that it's...
I just wanted to say I live in Salem, Mass, and we have mediums every other block, I think. So we do have an awful lot of this, and there are hordes of people who come forward. So we're still,
Right.
in this century, still people fascinated with things like seances.
That's right. I mean, it seems to be at Lilydale, a lot of the psychics there, they do these sort of individual readings. Like, they don't seem to be summoning up specters. That may be different. I mean, I feel like that is a difference in emphasis between the 19th century and the 20th century or 21st century forms of spiritualism. It's more like they're seeing this aura around you and so forth. So anyhow, yeah, and there were a number of court cases even with these mediums, this legal challenges to whether or not a particular medium was affecting fraud. Say, for example, if they would become connected with a wealthy aristocratic person who desperately wanted to make contact with a loved one. Was this person just taking their money, you know? So those are all out there. This is also, it's in the 1880s, the Society for Psychical Research is formed in London, and that's still very active today. In this group of then, it was primarily men. It was this attempt to scientifically show, and sometimes to debunk, paranormal activities and paranormal experiences. And actually Henry James, author of the ghost story, The Turn of the Screw, his brother was very, very active in that. Young was active in it as well, in terms of psychology. I mean, that's the thing, like spiritualism, this interest in ghosts and specters, it wasn't sort of a more marginal or fringe activity. Like even when I visited Lilydale afterwards, people are like, why don't you go up there? You know what I mean? Like you're just really sort of out there on the margins if you have an interest in that. I mean, the Brownings, Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, they attended seances. Queen Victoria attended seances. That's what I'm suggesting is more widespread. And then there is, with the invention of the daguerreotype and photography, there was this whole sort of genre of spirit photography where the medium would purport to manifest. It was actually a guy in Boston who was the first one. What was his name? Mumster or something like that. That was in 1860, where he purported to develop the first plate that showed a spirit.
Just a picture on top of a picture.
It looks like a picture on top of a picture to you?
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that earlier in the century, these effects could be easily achieved by just having a short exposure for, like, let's say this woman with her arms crossed here. So, like, all she'd have to do is run into the picture, go like this, and then kind of run out really quickly. You know what I mean? To be the short exposure time, and you get the ghostly apparition, you get that figure. Now, later in the century, you could easily have a superimposition of one image upon another in terms of the plates, and that technology was absolutely there. Yeah, and there was this, later in the century, this kind of famous case where a man said, look, I will allow you to watch me developing this plate so that you'll know that no fraud's going on. But the thing is, the people watching him had no idea what plates he was developing. You know what I mean? So there's always this question, too, whether this was fraudulent. And, you know, I did want to suggest, too, that in terms of this interest in spiritualism and the afterlife, that more largely this was a culture in which death and mourning, I mean, tended to take these very public, very monumental forms, which I think is different from our own time. Death tends to be much more privatized and medicalized. Oftentimes deaths are not occurring at home, for instance, and this is just it's the royal family. After the death of Prince Albert, the consort, the husband of Queen Victoria, and there's photograph and after photograph. And if you're in London, it's amazing how many monuments Victoria built to her husband. They're all there around London. You know, it was this sense that she wanted this kind of permanent effigy to remember him by. And here are all the royal princesses sitting around their father. It might be hard for you to see this, but this is little Beatrice, and she's actually quite blurry in the photograph. She's a kid, you know, so she's not holding herself really still. So she comes out a little blurry in terms of the exposure times. And then here's Victoria, the princess. This is her wedding day. So, okay, everybody comes together for the wedding photo with the bust of Prince Albert, you know. And, you know, I will say, and there's Queen Victoria gazing up at him longingly after his death in terms of this bust. I mean, his death, it did leave such an incredible hole in that family, because even though this was an era, we think of the angel in the house and how the woman was this kind of presiding domestic spirit over the household. I really think from the sort of diaries and biographies that Albert in a lot of ways was the angel in the house in terms of that royal household. It's like Victoria just wasn't that good at mothering. I mean, her mother was a complete disaster. She's sort of very vain and ambitious, and Victoria actually kind of kicked her out of the royal household for a while, whereas Albert was always very involved with the children. He would play with them, and so when he was gone, you know, it was just this consistent mourning. I mean, Victoria, I mean, you had 40, 45 years. She stayed in mourning, in terms of mourning clothes, until the day she died. So, yeah, I mean, we would tend to think, yeah, well, think about how we do, like, the stages of grief, you know, denial, you know, that's health, that you're moving beyond grief. That's not necessarily how they saw it, you know, at least in terms, I didn't hear as much people saying, oh, she was so excessive, you know. And just this notion of mourning attire, full mourning, a period of a year and a day. And this would usually be for somebody in the immediate family. I had one of my students in the Gothic class too bring in one of the old antique rings, a mourning ring from her family that had a lock of the deceased loved one's hair in it. Yeah, so and then we have second mourning, so that's 9 months, you know, so fabric trim and mourning jewelry, so you had to have black trim, very plain trim. And then 3 to 6 months, more elaborate fabrics used as trim. And this is usually, it's kind of women bearing, I would say, much more of the burden of mourning. Because a lot of men, you know, they would wear like black armbands and so forth, but that's not quite the same thing as having to get often, yeah, the whole, you know, we had the rise of all of these businesses too that specialized in being able to whip out these mourning outfits because the women had to have them, you know, within like 24 hours.
So what are these different periods for? So they mourned like a year and a day and then 9 more months and then
Right.
6 to 3 more months, so almost 3 years they were in mourning?
Now this would be primarily for someone in the immediate family. If it was a cousin, for example, and there were particular rules for how closely related the deceased was to you, you know, so it would be shorter. But even for, say, like a second cousin, you would be expected to be in mourning for some period. You know, I don't know if any of you watched Downton Abbey, but Mary's really mad, you know, that she has to act like she's in mourning for that guy she didn't even like. A family member that she didn't even care for, you know, that she has to look drab. And then just the sense of this public, sort of monumental notion of mourning. Some of you may be familiar with these. I mean, there are actually hundreds of these photographs archived on the internet, and I've not shown you the ones that I find most disturbing, because some of them I find very, very unsettling, particularly of the children. But it was this postmortem photography that I would say, you know, from 1860s up till, say, 1910, although you can find examples from certainly later in the 20th century of posing with the deceased. So this little girl has died, and there's the family. Yeah. And I think that what we find so disturbing about these images is the way that they would be posed in lifelike
Situation.
yeah, and here's the, you know, the 2 grieving parents. Some of the ones of children are particularly heartbreaking. They're surrounded by their teddy bears, you know, and their eyes are propped open. Or sometimes you would even actually have the body of the deceased standing. They would prop them up with wires behind them. I mean, it's so hard for us to imagine, like, why you would do this, or it seems so morbid. I've talked about it with students, but I just feel like it's just basically love. You know what I mean? Like, they want that image. And photography was so expensive, too. They may not have any photographs of a child, you know, but here's their one chance. It's very expensive to go to a studio or have somebody into your home, you know?
That wouldn't be the casket in the background there, would it? Look like it's covering a car or something.
I know. I don't know exactly what that's supposed to be. I don't know. I guess I kind of just thought that they were in the
Looks like she's in a bed reclining. That might be the headboard.
Yeah.
Oh, it might be. Okay. With the, with that just.
They go for the actual bodies that are propped up?
Right.
Yeah, she's
That's
deceased.
a dead person.
I just thought it
Yeah.
was her sister with her head
How does that help you
bad.
get over mourning?
It's remembrance. It's having a permanent image of the beloved. Yes.
My grandma, her family was from Lithuania, so she has pictures in the attic of the whole family surrounding a coffin. And she said they used it because then they'd send that back to the old country to tell the relatives there that that person died.
Right.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. You know, a number of the photographs I've seen are actually from Russia, you know. So I don't know if there's a kind of Eastern European, you know, particular attraction to this form as well.
Do you remember, I was just saying to somebody who wasn't aware of this, but Rick Santorum and his wife, when they lost their baby,
Yes.
they brought their baby home, dead, for the children to see their sibling.
Sure.
And that baby was there for a while.
Oh, okay. No, I was not aware of
And
that.
that's 2000, whatever this is. That was
Right.
2010 probably or something.
But you don't know of family photographs taken of the child, right?
I don't know that.
I mean,
No.
because that
No,
just
but I
seems
think
so
it's still
odd.
an interesting thing to bring home a baby who has died in the hospital.
Right.
Bring him home to your house for his brother and sister to see and to get a sense of the fact that they had this little brother in their family.
Right, right. It's probably imagining as a way to say goodbye, I
Yep.
guess. Yeah, yeah. So,
Chris, you have one more.
Am I the only one?
oh, yes, yes.
I have never heard that, Mary. Are those photographs rare? And do they cost a lot of money if you can find them?
Huh?
I would not say they're rare in terms of just the sheer number of images that I've seen collected in books or that you can see on the internet. Some of the ones on the internet drive me crazy though, because you don't have any sense of provenance, like in terms of dating or sort of where they're from, you know? I mean, they certainly look authentic, but I wouldn't say that they were necessarily rare, but I do think that the family needed to have a little bit of money even to pay.
Right.
In terms of for sale, I don't know. You know, I don't know about that. They might be. So just to move more specifically to the ghost story, you know, I did just want to suggest like the notion of one way we can think about these is just pure entertainment. I mean, we've got an increasing number of working middle class readers. They just basically want chills and thrills, you know. This is also an era, it's the rise of sensationalist novels and detective fiction and adventure tales, you know, like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island and Gothic narratives. And I'm also noting, you know, publishing these works, magazine installments, tended to encourage the creation of suspense and cliffhanger endings. Many of us who read for pleasure, I mean, we're very sort of used to those kinds of narrative or those kinds of story techniques. But a lot of the critics out there, they're really worried about the rise of these kinds of popular literature. I mean, and there is always this tendency, you know, if it's a work, if it's a novel that makes you feel, that seeks to make you feel in terms of chills and thrills, or it's overly sentimental, seeks to make you weep, that's seen as a lower form of literature, as a lower form of writing than a sort of serious, earnest writing of somebody like George Eliot, and that's writing that tries to make you think, you know? So this is definitely sort of within this era, and we had critics very much worried, especially young women reading these kinds of works that try to make you feel. There's this notion. Oh, you know, I'm talking just generally in terms of the Victorian, you know, we have increasing literacy rates, so increasing numbers of people are able to purchase, they have these really popular, cheap crime periodicals that people would pick up and read about these crime stories. Something like Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde later in the century, that was published as a basic railway novel, something short and really fun that you could read while you were on the train. So, yeah, there is a sense of entertainment, but like for the good middle class or upper class girl, critics really worried, you know, what I feel is always the unspoken anxiety behind this criticism of young women readers is that if they're seeking thrills and chills in their reading, is that going to encourage them to seek it in their life? You know what I mean? Like that they would cease to somehow be good girls. So there was this whole discourse and argument around this. And I think one interesting way to think about some of the ghost stories too is that they kind of empower what we would see as marginal social groups. Like for example, in terms of servants, you know, a lot of the Silver Fork novels from earlier in the 19th century, or many of the stories of Trollope or Thackeray, it's not like the servants have any special claim to truth. You know what I mean? Like they're not as highly educated as the actual members of the household. Or if they do have some kind of special knowledge, they're probably using it to try to blackmail somebody, you know? But in these stories, it's often, you know, the supposedly credulous, superstitious, servant, you know, they're right. You know what I mean? They see the ghost, they take the ghost as what it is, and it's the much more rational, scientific, often the scientific men in the house who often turn out to be doctors, they're the ones who can't see what's happening around them in terms of the haunting. So like the old nurse's story, you know, and here nurse, I'm talking about, you know, just basically like a nanny. I mean, she's like an old nanny for a wealthy family. She's the one who knows what's the whole backstory of this aristocratic man who threw out his young daughter and her illegitimate baby into the cold, and they died, and then she's coming and, you know, trying to get back in the house as a ghost and so forth. I mean, she's the one who knows what's going on. You know what I mean? She has the, I guess you'd call it narrative power. And she's a servant, you know, and something like Thomas Hardy's The Withered Arm, which I'd say is more largely the paranormal, but it's a old milkmaid. She's the one who seems to be in the know or understand what's happening in terms of this upper class woman's arm withering and getting, it's the curse and all of this is going on. Also women in these ghost stories, and a number of ghost stories that are kind of lost to us. They haven't become classics, but they were written by women. The Library Window is a really interesting one where there's this middle-class girl and she's sitting there reading and she looks out across the way and sees a very studious young man. And this was an era in which young women were wishing that they had more educational opportunities. I feel like it's almost a projection of her own wish that she could herself attain higher education. But she's the one who's able to see that specter, and we've come to find out later, yes, there was a young, studious man who died in this very spot. No, she's the only one who could see it. And then another really interesting aspect of a lot of the ghosts, you know, so like, and this is vampire tales too, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, and there's like Jekyll and Hyde and Sheridan Le Fanu, that these writers are all coming from Ireland and Scotland, you know, what we're thinking of as more, at least for many of the English, is more on the margins of the empire. Sheridan Le Fanu's an account of some strange disturbances in Ongier Street is such a fascinating story because it's this young man in a Dublin house, and you have this bright wallpaper, and the way it's described, it sounds very, very English, right? That this wallpaper has been imported from England. And it's this notion that somehow modernity, and these are young medical students, so they're very much, you know, up and coming about the contemporary times and progress, that you can somehow wallpaper over the past, you know. But then we find out that the ghost emerges from behind this wall, and he was a hanging judge. So he was a judge that hung many, many young men and even some young women back in his past, and then he ended up using a child's jump rope to hang himself from the banister. Okay, so his ghost comes back. But, you know, within an Irish context, he would have been a part of the Protestant ascendancy, right? He would have been sort of a member of the Protestant elite. We can imagine that many of the people that he would have been hanging would have been Catholics, you know? So it is the sense that somehow that traumatic past for Ireland is exerting itself in the present. One thing that's interesting about Le Fanu, too, as an Irishman, is that when he started publishing these stories in Dublin University Magazine, a publisher came and said, listen, if you ever want to make it, you've got to get rid of the Irish setting. And you've got to stop talking, you know, pitching this for Irish audiences. So after that, his stories basically all had English settings, and he ended up moving to England. And what's so interesting about this is that he took this story and reworked it for an English audience. So when I was in Ireland in Dungarvan this past term, the students and I spent some time looking at the changes between this ghost story for an Irish audience and then how he reconfigures that story for a British audience. I think the students came up with some really interesting ideas. And I did just want to, you know, thinking about this question, why did they, you know, what were these ghost stories doing for many of the Victorians? I think one sort of productive or interesting way to think about ghost stories is to suggest that they're reflecting certain kinds of cultural anxieties. And one of those, I would say, is certainly technology and railway travel in particular. I mean, it's much the same in terms of an anxiety as many of us feel when you get on an airplane. Like, your life is in somebody else's hands that you can't see. It seems to me like that's a little bit different from, say, being on a boat. You know what I mean? Like, theoretically, I can at least see if I'm going to go into an iceberg or the boat is sinking or something like that. But in terms of some of these horrific railway crashes in the Victorian period, I mean, you know, they just came out of nowhere. And Dickens himself, shortly before his publication of his ghost story, The Signalman, he was in a horrible car crash. And this was the Staplehurst car crash. And he was actually in, I've been trying to piece this together, but he would have been in like this railway car, because they describe it. He was not completely submerged down there in the water, but was sort of left hanging. So he was able to get out of the carriage and help some of the other passengers. But, you know, he was never the same after that. It was really just the sense that he was just shaky. I mean, shaky after there were a number of people perished in this. And The Signalman is all about this man who had the job of basically making sure, like, trains coming through a tunnel in different ways that they didn't crash into each other. And he's able to figure out where trains are coming from in terms of these signals that he'd hear, in terms of this like bell ringing. But then all of a sudden he's hearing them at odd times where no one really has signaled them, and then a crash will happen somewhere, right? So and he's also seeing this image of a ghost right in front of the train entrance going, hello there, hello there. So that's that story. It's really, really good. And English people all know The Signalman. Like, it's really central for them. And the BBC did a big BBC, you know, sort of one episode production of it that's actually really well done. I mean, maybe they're more into it because England is still more of a train culture, you know, than we are. So I feel like there is an anxiety you're putting
Train.
Train, yeah, railway. I mean, and when we're talking about this being the age of progress, I mean, for so many of the Victorians, it's like the railway travel, it's, you know, it's compressed space and it's speeded up time, and it's just this sort of transformation of how you inhabit space and time. But again, anxieties too. You're in this moving carriage, and the Staplehurst crash was caused by I don't know how this could have happened, but the railway line, there was some work being done on a portion, and it must have been some kind of human error that train that they did not realize that work was being done on that part of the line, and the train just completely derailed, you know? So, you know, big loss of life. This was all in the paper. Or thinking about other kinds of anxieties, like the notion of the influence of caregivers, like governesses, on one's own children. Anybody familiar with James, The Turn of the Screw? Okay, good. Can anybody give me a quick? You remember it?
No, I know I read it, but I can't remember that much, but I liked it.
Yeah, you did like it. This is a very nice BBC version of it. This woman is in Downton Abbey, too. She's Mary in Downton Abbey. She's a really good actress. Do you remember it, Julie? Like, what would this be in terms of anxieties about what's happening with your kids when they're with the caregivers?
I felt that it was the actual children who were evil in the story. There was that little boy in there they had the governess, and she was a new governess.
Right.
And she found that they were very, very bizarre. So I didn't know if it was actually the influence of the caregiver on the children. The author kept you wondering who was having an influence upon whom.
Exactly. I mean, it's a really, really great novella. I mean, the question is, so here comes this new governess, and the father of these children really wants nothing to do with them. So she's out in this kind of secluded mansion raising these 2 young children. And here's a governess, upper class household. You know, she's responsible for the moral and intellectual formation of these children. She's very young. And the story suggests that she kind of has a crush on the children's father. So she'll like do anything for him. So she gets out into this mansion, and these kids are bizarre.
Nocturnal.
But is it because they are haunted by an older servant and governess who have since died? Like there's this suggestion they might have been molested by them or simply exposed to their scandalous sexual affair. I mean, it's every sentence in that story is so carefully constructed to keep you wondering exactly as you're saying, Julie. I mean, who is influencing whom? And some later critics came and said, there are no ghosts. This new little governess, nervous little governess who comes in, she's completely crazy. She's projecting everything. Everything. There are no ghosts at all. And I don't want to give away the ending of it, but it's really good, you know. Or just thinking about probably one of the Victorian ghost stories that's still most with us in terms of being filmed and reproduced and parodied, and the Muppets and so forth. Like anxiety, economic calculation, you know, it's what Thomas Carlyle called the cash nexus, that comes to define human relationships. It's simply culture is becoming so much more commercial and material. That's very much there in Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I mean, and one thing I try to help students see with A Christmas Carol is the kind of satiric edge it has that I think is lost in a lot of ways for contemporary audiences. But we tend to think of Ebenezer Scrooge. Okay, he's miserly, he's selfish, oh, he's awful, you know, we're not like him, right? But in the story, you know, it's very clear that he supports certain kinds of legislation, like the poor laws, that basically rounded a lot of the Victorian poor up and put them in these workhouses where they worked for like nothing, and husbands were separated from wives, parents were separated from children. He makes his political position really clear. And I think that he was wanting his complacent middle class readers to realize, well, if you support those kinds of policies, you're like Ebenezer. You know what I mean? So. But now we tend, I don't know, see it more as a kind of warmity or something like that. So, okay, so that's Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And this is just a final point that I wanted to see what kinds of thoughts we had. I really want, now some of you might say, okay, these are stories like about the devil, like The Exorcist, for example, as opposed to a ghost per se, you know. But I'm just saying, largely, if we're thinking that the sort of predominant kind of ghost stories or stories of paranormal within a culture somehow reflect larger cultural anxieties. And I really tried to choose some films that I think became cultural phenomena. I mean, there are tons and tons of horror films. My gosh, I walked through the video store, it seems like every other one. And some of them look so goofy. Like, have you seen the ad? Like it's for this nun. She's somehow possessed. Her eyes are. That one's out there right now. You know, it just seems so dumb. But these, you know, these are really interesting. I mean, The Exorcist. What was that? 73. I'd have to. I don't know. Does that sound about right? And then The Shining, maybe 80. About 1980, Paranormal Activity. Now there are 3 of these films. So that was, the first film was in 2009.
Is it 3D yet?
What? I'm sure it is. I didn't see the second 2. It sounded, I don't know, it didn't sound that good to me. But, okay, so here's my theory, and I just want to throw it out there and see what you think about it. But it seems to me like our imagination is not attached to, in contemporary times, stories where there's just like a ghost out there. You know what I mean? Like it's like they have to come and somehow possess. They have to go inside the central characters. Because The Exorcist, in terms of the film, very much starts out like a ghost story. Little Regan has her Ouija board, and oh, you hear a bunch of banging up in the attic, that's where the story starts out. Okay, well, finally it's the sense that the devil has possessed the little girl, Regan. But I'm still putting in this general category, at least early on, of the ghost story. And then The Shining, that has all kinds of ghosts, but then we have a sense that the central character, played by Jack Nicholson, that he's somehow becoming possessed by the dead, because he goes crazy. What's he say? Oh, here's Johnny. That's his famous line from that when he bangs in the door. Yeah, so, okay, but possession. And then for Paranormal Activity, that's just like a straightforward ghost story that the young couple in their Pottery Barn house, that they capture, you know, on video camera. But then we have the evil presence possessing, I mean, I won't give it away too much, but possessing one of those. So why, I mean, if we're saying that somehow these stories reflect cultural anxieties, do any of you have a theory or idea of why this notion of possession, that somehow the presence has to come inside the person, like why that would be a kind of dominant narrative for us or a dominant story for us? I'm not saying I have an answer, you know.
What about these stories that you read of angels? I believe these stories.
About angels, and actually a woman I met over in Dungarvan, she published a whole book on that. Yeah, she's really, and like she writes all about how they're in scripture and stuff. Okay, but I'm focusing on evil stuff. But, I mean, and that's what I'm interested in, is, you know, like, what do we fear? What do we find scary? I mean, Sigmund Freud said, like, for something to really frighten you, for it to be uncanny, it has to be the unheimlich, or the unfamiliar arising within the familiar. And I think that's part of the reason why the postmortem photography can seem so uncanny, because they pose as women or children as lifelike. And that's very common, you know, just to see like family portrait, but then it's the unfamiliar in terms of death or a corpse emerging in the familiar. So, I don't know, I'm just going off with that theory.
I think they had to take it to the next level. You know, things are never gory enough, bloody enough, whatever enough. And
Yeah.
so to go to a higher step and bring the evil being within a person, it has much more of a fear factor than just a ghost flying through the air and doing little silly things here and there. That's my
Right.
simple take.
You mean for these modern ones with
Mhm.
the?
Yeah, that you're saying they have to up it
Right,
and sort of continually sort of push the envelope.
and
But
increase the anxiety. Who knows?
because as spectators or movie watchers, we're imagining what it would be like to be somehow possessed by something evil.
But, you know, mankind has not changed down through the ages. Everything has just intensified. When you look at, you know, cavemen and the wheel, and now we have the wheel, and, you know, going from the horse and buggy to outer space. And so as you become more, let's say, sophisticated, meaning more advanced, you just intensify everything, just like Mary Lou said. Everything becomes more intensified because the calm and the tranquil is not what we want.
Right.
And you look at all the movies, and it pushes the envelope to the max. Look at our kids today.
But you know, I would want to put these kinds of films in a different category than what I'm saying. I agree with this notion of
But-
intensity, like
but what-
Hostel and Saw,
Okay,
these
but
films,
what
people are getting
sells
cut
them?
up and so forth.
What sells in the newspaper? What sells the movies? It's the evil more than the good, for the
Okay.
most part.
So
People are more
wouldn't that
interested in
suggest
the
that
bad.
we would want to break from that evil? You know what I mean? Like, why would we seek it in stories that we willingly pay, you know,
Because that's
$9 or
what
what?
sells. That's
Just
what
we don't
sells.
know. Fascinating.
It's a, yeah.
There might be an explanation for the evil that we find in the world. And, you know, you can excuse someone who, quote, is possessed because he is possessed. He can't help it, he's possessed. So it may very well be an attempt to find some explanation for that oddity, that something that's unusual.
Right, it's finding some kind of explanation for why people do the evil things that they do. But most people would not accept an explanation that, oh, Satan came, you know what I mean? Like somebody who commits a horrible crime or something.
Devil made
Yeah.
me do it.
Yeah, the devil made me do it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
interesting to think of that as an explanation.
I find a common thread with all of these, and throwing in there Amityville horror as well.
Right, right.
You're cut off from the rest of society. You're isolated.
That's
and
right.
it becomes personal. And yet there's one individual in all these stories that kind of comes in and try to help, but ultimately it doesn't really help. So that there's this feeling of you just can't fight it. It's very personal, and you're cut off from everybody else.
That's
Like
true,
poltergeist.
and that is, you could do a really interesting study of like the people who come in and try to help, you know, because they get a medium to come in here, and then The Exorcist I find really interesting too, because this was a period when we had all of this talk about what's happening to the American family in terms of divorce and so forth. And you know, Regan's mother, I mean, she's not married, I can't remember. Oh yeah, I think she is divorced from her husband. But like, she's this woman who can't deal with this child, Regan. So you have to have the father, you know, in terms of a Catholic father, step in and sort of fill that void and make things right, you know. And interesting movement thinking about it within the period.
And if life, you know, is becoming more intensified and kind of, you know, the evil that we see in the world, either we know it more or are told about it more or seek it out more. A lot of times I think the reason we read these things or go and see these things is so that we have a sense of mastery of the thing, you know. I've finished this book, I read the book, I've survived, I've gotten through this, you know.
Like almost
I've gotten
catharsis
past
or
it,
something.
and the audience member in the same way. You go see
Right.
The Exorcist, you've seen possession, you've seen the demons or whatever, and yet you leave, you go home and have dinner. You kind of, you know, you get past it, you get through it, and it gives you that kind of sense of mastery over these evils, you know, to a certain degree, you get past them.
Yeah, I think that-
Different kind of, I mean, I do think we also seek out the thrill and the, you know, and the excitement of the piece, but we do it knowingly that we will
That's
get
right.
past it,
They,
get
we
through
will,
it.
but see, that's interesting in terms of the way they market something like Paranormal Activity. I can read this better on the screen. Paranormal Activity is one of the scariest movies of all time. You will be affected, as it's hard to ignore the imprint it leaves on your psyche.
Yeah.
Nightmares are guaranteed. So, right, so that's, this film, you're not gonna be able to get past it. You aren't gonna be able to sleep that night.
So
you know.
coming from it from a different perspective, from the idea of the Southern Gothic, which is what I know more
Sure.
than a Victorian Gothic, it's that notion that you never get over the haunting. That, you know, Faulkner says the past isn't behind us; it's not even past. Right, and so
Right.
it's constantly present, and we're haunted by it, and we can't move past it.
Right, that sense that you can't move past, and that's what, certainly at the end of Turn of the Screw, the governess is never gonna be the same. I mean, and you have this sense of her as an absolutely broken woman.
Who wrote
So,
this
yeah.
Paranormal Activities? We can't read it.
Who wrote it? No, this isn't from like a book or anything, this is just the film.
Oh, a film.
Did you hear about this film?
No.
The whole thing, you're watching through a video camera, so it's this realism effect. Because this couple is trying to capture what's happening in their house. No, Kevin Bacon's not in it. Woody Allen's in it. I'm sorry, any final comments or?